How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulier Gonzalez here. So, I do want to explore in today's video about this concept that, for example, Josh Komeva, a software engineer that previously worked at Khan Academy, one of the first large companies to ever use React at scale, and they are now non-profits online education platforms that is tremendous in terms of understanding now, or if you're even old or not that old, so to keep up is with the understanding of the high school, in school, and university or AP curricula. This is just a fancy way to say, hey, what is the actual state in the high school or the educational system that that not only that is still relevant, but that over the year this has been updated. Because in my case, I went through high school in the mid 20s, sorry, in the late 20s, all right, 2010, something like that, you know, and from 2000 and 2010, but now it has passed 16 years, and of course, like business and in life, everything evolved. So because of that, I also scheduled some couple seasons, especially on the physics or the modern physics, to understand is, what is this thing called light and particle, among other topics. For example, is the use or the basic building block in transistor or in modern computer, which is the transistors. But this is not a course for that, or this is not a video of those topics. Here, I want to now is explore the CSS spec by reading about how is this made of, what is the organization, what is the structure, and how you can describe the CSS in a nice, compelling story that you can engage with it. So because there's a lot of people out there and love to feel proud about, hey, I am somebody that I don't care about centering a div and stuff like that, and they carry that like a proud badge, right? And that's fine, that's good, right? If you have come so far in the software engineering profession, particularly on the web, without knowing how to center a div, that's fine. But in my case, I prefer to go into this because I just want to master this, to understand that. So I don't need to look at the spec that often, only to receive updates, right? So, and in terms of that, because here we're looking at the render in Logic 2. So just to make the quick recap. So the CSS here, which is made by the the Triple W consortium, which is a bunch of smartphones across different browser vendors or software companies, where the idea behind this is to create now principle or standards based on the accessibility of the web, the privacy, the internationalization, and security, right? And in terms of accessibility, you can look at this is the 4 pillars of making the web work, right? So remember that at the end of the day, this was created or funded as part of a military contract as a response to, for example, or to what happened in 1957 when the Russians put the first satellite on our heads. And that caught Eisenhower by surprise, but it didn't cut, for example, the military-industrial complex, among other individuals that's go beyond the scope of today's video. But in any case, because of that, the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, right? They were investing in different technologies. One of them is geology. This is why this field actually boomed back in the 50s and in the 60s. All right. And also, what these smart folks at this kind of university, like the San Diego and the MIT, and, what they were doing with this thing called computers. They were capable to now is send data from one computer physically separated or geographically separated, and also now take control, remote control of that computer. So because that was something that is in the interest of the military industrial complex at that moment. So now it creates, over the couple decades, ways of how you can manage those computers in a network in a way that is effective, right? So protocols, ways of doing this was, for example, the TCP/IP, which establishes, instead of trying to control the network, let's going to focus is on how the communication happens between pairs. All right. In order to locate those devices on the internet, we have now the IP to do that. So this is what you have now: the transmission control protocol and the IP address, right? Which is, this protocol wins over thousands of protocols back then in the 70s. So moving forward, right? Because it's also now around the idea of creating this kind of networks. There also was the notion of creating now programs that allow you to take remotely control of a computer and to describe now basic needs. For example, in the economic sense, things like the business size of banking and accounting, right? This actually was the first main use of the software, and this notion of developing this set of instructions and then execute it on this physical device, it was something that during the 60s, in the NATO conference, when there was this explosion of language back then, they come up with and say, hey, let's want to find a ways to create now best practices, standards, in order to make these particular applications to work. In other words, this software to work. And the first was coined the terms of software engineering was Margaret Hamilton. I think that's the name. So Margaret Hamilton. Yep. And because she was working at the NASA back then, and she has, well, extensive experience, for example, writing these things called software. It's like, holy French toast, guy, you know? This is no pages. This is books on top of books, bro. Right? Series of instructions, handwritten for the Apollo 11 mission. So, in other words, as this software things evolve, which is, there was something engineering, there was something sequence in terms of describing how this set of instructions relate to each other, and how do we build now applications on top of that. In the 80s, there was now a collaboration and efforts for several developers and software engineer around the field, that they come up with this thing called is not only procedural programming or functional programming, but sometimes you need to describe is those systems in terms of processes or in terms of objects, right? So how you define is now a systems in terms of the the goal here, right? And this is why you have now things like small talk or things like this first object-oriented programming that takes inspiration is all of the heavy liftings from previous engineers in the fields, where the whole point of this is that there is a recurring theme in our programs that sometimes we need to bundle this data and functionality together, right? And this is a pattern that that we look across all of these procedure programs, all right? And it'll be somewhat nice if we have now a particular way to describe of application in that sense. So why am I mentioning all of this? And I know that I take a huge segue here, because isn't this about CSS? So all of this is just to describe is how do we get here in this CSS stuff, and how does it fit here? Because as we now, as community, we develop this notion of creating our programs using data and functionality and bundle that together, right? Which was very useful, and that was during in the 70s and the 80s. So not only that, sometimes we need to develop application that runs on our local machines, right? But also applications that run in somebody else's machines. And somehow you need to communicate to that or to share that documents on top of that. So locally for us, there was a huge effort made in the CERN, the Comité Européen pour la Recherche Nucléaire. Well, it is French, as you can imagine. So this committee, one of the Smorkfall back then, he made a proposal in terms of exchange documents over a protocol, right? And they coined this as the HTTP, right? Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this HTTP, right, which now begins with the idea of that you can share now documents, XML documents or HTML documents across computers, right? And in order to provide now a styling to this, you use now CSS, or functionality you use now JavaScript. And all of this is when now the CSS fits into this. So again, why am I mentioning this? Because the entire community around the web, they create now, so they find out that this is very important to create some sort of a standards or some body that oversees these standards in some way, and they come up now with the DoubleTree Consortium, or the World Wide Web Consortium, right? So again, I'm gonna mention this because this is again a group of people, smart folks that works across different companies, or even web vendors and so on and so forth, that they come up with this set of principles when it comes to overseeing these standards, right, on the web, that you need to provide accessibility. And there is a particular website that you can look at that, known as the Web Authoring Guidelines, that describe the authoring web practice guidelines, that describe is these common patterns in the UI, and why you should stick to that, because that's show that is very useful, right? And they follow now is on the accessibility standard, which is a particularly spec like the area, right? If you take a look at this, is in terms of how do you now create accessible, rich internet applications here, right? And understand the roles models, right? What is described and the attributes for that. Again, this is just to describe this particular topic here, okay? So accessibility. And the other is internationalization, because it all started developing these web applications for Western cultures, right? But now as you're starting to create and provide and distribute your software across different cultures, Middle East, Southeast Asia, in even in South America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Australia, Russia, or Eurasia, right? So you started to need to describe is all of the possible symbols that these cultures that has come with, right? This is known as part of the character encoding, which is right now is the UTF-8, right? So this actually describes, hey, these symbols is going to map with this sequence of numbers, right? And all of the well-known symbols, right? So far, is known as the basic multiplane, the basic multilingual plane. I think something is that. But in any case, this is also an effort to recognize that, and because you have now is this internationalization that describes all of the possible characters that you can go with, and the other is the localization, which it's a hey, there are several cultures that they use certain things, for example, numbers or currency, and we need to cover those here on the web, right? And the other is privacy and security, right? So I mentioned is these 4 pillars, right? Because now the web has evolved to not be so private or secure, you know? So in any case, there is also all of the stakeholders of the web, Amazon, yada, 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 right? And when you look now at what are the standards here, right, at least at the draft, right? And if you take a look now at the CSS, right? CSS now it is made of several modules here. So the whole point of this, right, is just to get yourself familiar with this CSS stuff. What is the CSS? Well, which allows us to describe is the styling, or the look and feel of your components or your documents here. And there's some concepts that are important for us to understand. So CSS cascading style, or the CSS, style sheets, source documents. So what is the styles that you want to, the documents that you want to apply your styles, all right? And there are several documents. Even here is describing is a document language, right? This document language can be is HTML, which is the most common that we know, or XHTML, or SVG, or even MathML, which is another one, all right? The author is the person who writes the documents, and the styling, in my case, right now here, right? So the user, which is the person who interacts with this document, and the user agent, which is allows to the user to interact with this document by interpreting these documents and applying these stylings and generate a format that it can be consumed by the user. In other words, it is the either is visual or this visual screens, or either is print media, right? Or even read it out loud. And I want to hit the break here real quick because when you started to explore other technologies, so for example in the case of Bitcoins, right, which is a very, very on the mouth of everyone right now, this particular notion, especially of the user agents and the user and the author, right, is important because there will be always is a program that is going to interpretate those structures or those statements and making something available to the user to consume or to interact with. In this case, this user agent is this software that allows the user to interact with by interpreting is this document, and it is a style, as well as the functionality, which is with JavaScript, and provide that in a way that you as a user can consume, whether it is visually or by reading out loud the content or by printing it. And that's very, very, very interesting. And don't take my word for granted. This is just describing what the spec says. So in that content or in that themes, right? He is also describing is the W3C process and CSS. Okay. So how is these people actually integrate or reach a consensus to define all of these different rules and standards, right? So again, this section is not normative, right? But you have now a working draft and the candidate recommendation and the recommendation, right? So this is the W3C process. And this process, right, is making the web is a mission of making the web work for everyone. So brings it together global stakeholders to develop open standards that enable the World Wide Web that connects and empower humanity. Sorry about that. The WD3C process document describes the organizational structure of W3C and processes, responsibilities, and functions that enables W3C to accomplish its mission. This document does not describe the internal working of the team, but what is described is the structure of and processes and responsibility of these functions, right? So you get the idea, right? So it's describing is the relationship, the introduction here, the members who make this, right? And again, this goes beyond of today's video, but I just wanted to bring this up that that's a lot. The technical reports, as you can see. But here's the thing, right? A recommended track document passed through the 3 levels of stability. So in any proposal, it passes through this 3 levels of stability. Summarized as the working draft, candidate recommendation, which is in the testing phase. So working draft is on the design phase. Candidate recommendation is on the testing phase. And then you have now recommendation. This is the complete state of the spec. Pretty interesting. I didn't know about this. And here, as you can see, now that we know the process of how the commit or these consortiums defined to pass through a champion or a candidate all the way up until the proposals, right, or to the recommended state. Okay, so now you have the classification of the CSS spec here. Interesting. So most of the time these specs are organized by different models. So don't take my word for granted. look at this, a list of CSS models stable and in progress, and their statuses can be found in the CSS current work page. Okay, so that's interesting, right? So if you want to look at all of the CSS models, stable and in progress, all right, which is the recommendation and the candidate recommendation, or the working draft, and their status, you can find them in the CSS current work page. So when I look at this, right, and in this section, a specification is not a manual. There is not a SKU for badly written draft, and please complain if you find one. But specs do target a specific audience, right? Understanding the CSS spec by GWA Singberg has written another useful on how to read the W3C spec, or you can read more about modules, levels, snapshot, and CSS processes, right? So now we're starting to make sense of this thing called CSS. It is organizing modules. There are several folks that they have they have wrote some documents in order to know how to read this spec. The spec is not a manual, all right? And even though here we can look at, as you can see, all the different models and their status, and the different color here, right? If this is a working draft, or this is a candidate recommendation, or a proposed recommendation, or a recommendation and supersede recommendation, right? So the idea is not to memorize all of this. I don't have an intention to memorize all of this. It's just to look at what are the way in which the CSS is structured. Okay. So if you look at the stable or the recommended, not the working draft and things like that, which might be quite interesting at least to just to overlook, but fairly quickly. But it's to understand this one, right? So you have now the containment level, the box model, the basic user interface level, the writing modes, fonts, cascading and inheriting level, CSS style attributes, which is when describing is things like how do you now apply your styles and how the styling is parsing, right? Again, this is not a manual. Spec is not a manual, but it can be used to read and to understand more about this. So you have now the box model, basic user interface, writing modes, fonts, cascading and inheriting levels, style attributes, media query levels, CSS level 2 revision, and if you dig into this, you're gonna see more about that. Selectors, CSS namespace, colors, and then the other things as it is, right? And here on the revision, right, is describing now is what are the fundamentals of the CSS. If you read fairly quickly here, this specification defines the cascading style sheet level 2 revision CSS 2.1 is a style sheet language that allows author and users to attach style, font, and spacing to structure documents, HTML document and HTML applications, right? CSS 2.1 builds on the CSS 2, which builds on CSS 1, and it supports media-specific styles so that author may tailor the presentation of their documents to visual browsers, aural device, which is quite weird that they call that, dispositivos aurales, printers, braille device, handheld device, and etc. This is what the user agents can do, right? So it can turn your documents into to visual browsers, or for speech recognition, printer, braille device, and handheld device, among others. It also supports content positioning, table layout, features for internationalization, and some properties related to user interface. 2.1 is correct. A few errors in CSS 2, the most important being a new definition of the height and width of absolute positioning elements, more influence for HTML style attributes, and new calculation of the clip property, and adds a few highly requested features which has been already been widely implemented. Most of the CSS 2.1 represent a snapshot of the CSS usage. It consists of all the CSS features and are implemented interoperably at the date of the publication and the recommendation. So CSS 2.1 is derived from and is intended to replace CSS 2. And some part of the CSS 2 are unchanged in CSS 2.1. So this has become like a replacement for it. Some part has been altered and some parts removed. The removed portion may be used in CSS 3 specifications. Future spec in exactly CSS 3 specification. So in other words, this is lay out the foundations of how now the author of these styles are gonna use this to structure their documents or to style in their documents. That is gonna be is gonna be use this style for the author or for these user agents to present the content. And here you have is that, right? So the syntax and the basic data, selector, assign property values, cascading and inheritance, media types, box model, visual formatting model, which is what I'm currently at here. All right. On the visual formatting models, you have now the visual formatting model, the controlling box generations, and the positioning scheme here, as well as the normal flow, the floats, absolute positioning, and layer presentation, which is with the C index property. So this has been more as a theory overview, but in the next video, I'm going to look at a more hands-on approach by exploring is how these things behave. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.